On the night of the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia cruise ship ran aground off the island of Giglio, west of Italy. Its carcass lay off the Tuscan coast for a year, a grim reminder of one of the most bizarre catastrophes in nautical history, and of the incredible series of blunders that took 32 lives. On the 13th of January 2012, a huge ship lay wrecked just meters from the shore of Giglio. By morning, more than 4,000 people from all over the world were marooned on this island that is normally home to just 600. Now, for the first time, the whole story can be told.
It was a very hard night, a night that time stood still because daylight never seemed to come. We islanders just kept looking at one another and saying, "Is this really happening?" Because it was something unthinkable, absolutely unthinkable.
The mayor of Salzburg in Austria barely escaped on a lifeboat and saw the first bodies being brought to shore.
Auf der Insel selber das war mitten in der Nacht dann, das war was weiß ich, 2.
It was the middle of the night, and until about 2 a.m., people just stood around in the port or just sat down here, there, wherever they could. There was no infrastructure, nothing. This is the point when I first saw the faces of the dead. The bodies were taken from boats and laid onto the dock, then covered by a sheet. So it was already clear at that point that there were victims.
Zugedeckt, aber es war erkennbar, es war da schon erkennbar, dass es Tote gibt.
As dawn rose over Giglio, boats swarmed around the massive wreck. The ship's captain, Francesco Schettino, was taken away and later arrested. The whole story of what really happened that night on the Costa Concordia would only fully emerge later. The $570 million Costa Crociere ship was one of the most luxurious cruise ships on the seas. Yvonne and Roger Pols live in the Black Forest near Freiburg, Germany. They had never seen anything like the Costa Concordia.
Enormous. You have the restaurants, you have 4 bars, and you have a wellness system, 3 or 4 pools, and you have a sauna. And it's unbelievable.
Totaal zijn er 3 of 4 zwembaden erop. Men heeft een sauna erop. Het is ongelooflijk.
The Costa Concordia was a city that never slept. There were 11 cabin decks, with 26 lifeboats on deck 4. Decks 1 and up were for the 3,000 paying passengers, while 1,000 crew and staff occupied the lower decks.
Wat eigenlijk de boot inhoudt of behelst, laat ons zo zeggen.
The ship as a whole is nothing like what you see in the brochure. It made an impression on me. You arrive in the entrance hall near the ship, and you are standing in front of this enormous, indescribable, metal thing.
Ian Fraser was one of the star entertainers on board.
I've had so much fun on ships. They're a fantastic place to work, a wonderful place to holiday, and yes, I would definitely go back on board.
As the Concordia pulled out of Civitavecchia port on the 13th of January, the route should have taken her safely between the mainland and the small island of Giglio. But Captain Schettino had already ordered a change in the ship's course to do a close sail-by of the rocky island. It was the first of many deadly mistakes. Among the passengers was the Swedish journalist Jan Mosander.
De första 6 dagarna var fantastiska.
The first 6 days were fantastic. Not a cloud in the sky. We docked in 5 different harbours during the journey. We went ashore every morning for a walk.
Promenerade.
Mosander was a cruise veteran, but it was the very first cruise for 23-year-old Milène Litzler and her fiancé, Michael Blémont. The vacation package was an ill-fated gift for the birthday that was to be her last.
C'était l'histoire de se retrouver tous les deux.
They wanted to be together a bit because Milène and Michael had different jobs. One worked during the night and the other during the day. They spent the last day in Rome, and Milène took a picture of herself in front of the Trevi fountain, throwing coins in for luck.
The ship's classical violinist was Sándor Fehér from Hungary. His family and friends are speaking out for the first time since he died.
I was deeply shocked. I saw it on the television. That's how I heard about it on the news. Even when the catastrophe was shown, I was sure that nothing serious could have happened to Shani, especially because he'd been working on ships for 10 years.
My name is Jeno Shanya. I was playing with the Bianco Trio on board the Costa Concordia with Sándor Fehér. He was our band leader. On that night, January 13th, when everything started, we were actually off stage for an hour, so we went to our cabin.
Sándor Fehér was a violinist on board. I'd worked with him on a previous contract. He was unbelievable on the violin. The things he was doing, the technicality, the joy of his playing.
Shani worked on ships for over 10 years. In the beginning, he liked it very much, as any young man would, but that feeling gradually faded after a few years. His plan was to go to the United States to work as a violin teacher and also become a member of an orchestra.
As the Concordia left port on the night of the 13th of January, no one could guess what tragic destiny awaited them. As the sun set over the island of Giglio, Captain Francesco Schettino welcomed passengers aboard the Costa Concordia for their cruise around the Mediterranean. At 51, he was an experienced captain. That evening, he dined with a Costa-employed Moldavian dancer while his first officer took command. Before leaving port, he had promised his head waiter, who was from Giglio, that he would perform a sail-by salute of the island. The Costa Concordia had done a similar salute of Giglio 5 months beforehand, and all had gone smoothly. The second officer charted the new course, but the ship's charts didn't show the rocks in detail. At 9:34 p.m., Captain Schettino went to the bridge to take command. The dancer and the head waiter went with him. The ship was on autopilot, and the helmsman was on the lookout. Schettino ordered the helmsman to take manual control and set the Costa Concordia to a new course. Then Schettino picked up the phone and called a retired captain from Giglio and asked if it was safe to sail by. Satisfied with the answer, he proceeded. At 9:39 p.m., he took command. As the sequence of maneuvers that doomed the ship began, the unsuspecting passengers enjoyed their last minutes of fun.
Dus wij hadden een zeer, zeer luxueus en prachtige avondmaal.
First, we had a very, very luxurious dinner. Everything was perfect and delicious and good. Then we went to our cabin, At about 9:30 we went up to the theatre for the show, which was a magician.
In het theater de voorstelling met de magician.
Jag och min hustru, vi satt i...
My wife and I were sitting in the main theatre, the Athena Theatre. I think there was room for about 800 people, and we were watching the evening's show, which was a magic show, with a magician called Magic Martin.
Magic Martin.
Captain Schettino increased speed, but, realizing he was too close to the coast, ordered several turns to starboard. At times, the Indonesian helmsman had difficulty understanding. Just 4 minutes after Schettino had officially taken command, the 290-meter-long ship was just 450 meters from the rocks and headed for collision. But a 15-knot northeasterly wind reduced the effect by half. At 9:44 p.m., he ordered hard to starboard, pointing the ship out to sea. Then he ordered port 10, hoping that by pushing her left, it would take her around the rocks. He added hard to port. But, incredibly, the first officer ordered the opposite. Schettino corrected him immediately, but it took 13 seconds for the rudders to adjust. 2 seconds later, the 51,000-ton ship smashed into the rock.
The ship leant violently to the port side, so much so that the can of drink shot across the cabin. I had to hold on to my computer that was sliding off my lap on the bed. The computer was falling off. And there was a very unusual noise that people still refer to, a sort of a dig-dig-dig-dig-dig-dig, which vibrated the ship violently and then stopped.
It
was about 15 minutes into the show that we felt this crash and shuddering. At first we thought it was part of the show. Very soon after we heard an announcement over the loudspeaker saying not to worry, it was just an electrical blackout. I turned to my husband and jokingly said, "Yeah, that's what they said on the Titanic too." And he laughed at me.
Hij heeft mij uitgelacht.
5 percre rá
We felt a huge blow. It was so powerful that it even lifted up the television. I have been working on ships for more than 10 years, but I have never felt anything like that. We thought that the blow was pretty big and that there could have been some problems. 20 seconds later, all the lights went out in the cabin.
másodpercre elment az összes világítás. A kabinban nem volt világítás.
In just 20 seconds, more than 2,000 tons of water had flooded the engine room up to the crew deck and blown out the electrics panel. The rudders became stuck at 35 degrees to starboard. The bilge pumps and self-righting systems failed. The ship listed to the left. It was a death blow to the Costa Concordia.
DG1, DG2, DG3 sono allagati, l'acqua continua a salire. Nei pressi del volano del motore. Nei pressi del volano del motore, mi dice. Sta uscendo dal ponte zero l'acqua, comandante.
Schettino phoned the ship's owners, Costa Crociere, in Genoa. What the crisis manager told him is still unclear. Incredibly, no one called a general emergency. The Concordia drifted past the port of Giglio and out into the open sea, as, unbelievably, orders came from the bridge for passengers to make their way through the labyrinth of the tilting ship to their cabins.
¿Tú por qué andas con salvavidas si todo está bien? ¿Tú por qué este?
De sound technician is weggerend. Dan de magician is van het podium gesprongen, is weggerend.
The sound technician ran away, and then the magician jumped down off the podium and ran away and never came back. Then we saw people coming into the theatre with life jackets over their clothes.
Yvonne and Roger Pols went to their cabin on deck 6.
We zijn naar beneden gegaan naar de cabine.
We finally got to our cabin, and that's when we realized that it was very serious. It was dark. A steward came over to us because the key card wasn't working and told us, "Take your coat, take your life jacket." And then he said to my husband, "Don't forget your medicine."
Life jacket nemen, En tot mijn man heeft hij gezegd, vergeet uw medicamenten niet.
Så då kom det
When we came out into the first lobby, people were running. Passengers were coming out of the restaurants. And there, it was even more chaotic because plates and food and chairs had been flying around in there.
Där hade porslin och mat och stolar och allt hade ju flugit omkring där i.
The Mozanders went up to their cabin on deck 8 to get their life vests and personal things and stepped out onto their balcony to get their bearings.
Då såg jag 150 meter, kanske 200 meter längre bort.
I saw 150 meters, maybe 200 meters away, lights. It was land. It was the small port of Giglio. So I said to my wife, if things get really difficult here, then we'll have to swim. I came back in from the balcony of the cabin, and there was a total blackout. About half a minute passed, and we managed to get out into the corridor again and down to the muster station. Then in the crowd, people were pushing from the back.
Den här folksamlingen, det tryckte på människor bakom.
The Coast Guard grew alarmed after receiving calls from the families of crew reporting an emergency.
Buonasera Costa Concordia, cortesemente avete dei problemi a bordo voi? Sì, affermativo, abbiamo un blackout a bordo e stiamo verificando le condizioni. Che tipo di problema? Solamente il generatore, perché i carabinieri di Prato hanno ricevuto una telefonata di un parente di un marittimo che diceva durante il pranzo mi è cascato tutto in testa. No, negativo, abbiamo un blackout e stiamo verificando le condizioni a bordo.
Unconvinced, the Coast Guard scrambled a helicopter to see for themselves. Providence, meanwhile, would come to the rescue. The very same northeasterly wind that had interfered with the Concordia's steering now turned the ship and pushed it back towards the island.
I remember going out on deck and seeing that the land was relatively near and a flotilla of boats was nearby. And again, you just think nothing bad's going to happen here. We're near land. Okay, we're leaning a bit, but my thoughts were we have a show tomorrow night, so we'll be back on board. Make sure you keep your voice warm and don't worry and be focused for the show tomorrow night.
There were still no evacuation orders from the bridge. But by now, passengers could see that the Concordia was taking on water and leaning heavily to the right. So they gathered on deck 4, where the lifeboats were. Many went to the wrong muster station.
Wij zijn naar level 4 gegaan omdat we wisten dat daar de lifeboats
We went to deck 4 because we knew that was where the lifeboats were. It was while we were standing there that we noticed we had a letter B on our life jackets, yet we were standing at muster station A.
En we stonden aan kant A.
Michael and Mylène made their way to muster station B and texted their parents in Paris.
They sent an SMS at 11:15 p.m. saying there was a problem on the ship and that they had their life jackets on and that they had to leave and embark on a lifeboat. When we received the SMS, we were so tired we didn't see it straight away. We only saw it in the morning, at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Odaálltunk mi is, és akkor jött oda egy olasz hölgy.
We were standing there when an Italian lady asked for life jackets for her kids. Sándor went away and brought back as many jackets as he could carry in his arms. Then he had to put them on the kids because the parents were so terrified that they couldn't do it.
Rakta a gyerekekre, mert a szülőknek annyi jelenlétük nem volt, lelki jelenlétük, hogy a saját gyerekükre ráadják a mentőmellényt.
Yvonne and Roger had to cross the tilting ship.
En dan begon het grote avontuur, want het is niet...
That is when the adventure began, because we had no idea how big the ship really was. We thought it wasn't even 10 meters wide, but it was very broad. And it wasn't level. We could barely stand up, and we had nothing to hold on to.
On deck 4, Yvonne and Roger Pols could see that the lifeboats were full and the staff were having trouble with them.
Dat was de eerste moment.
That was the first moment when I really felt scared. We could see they were having trouble with the lifeboat and that there was no room on the lifeboats. And that was the first moment we looked at each other and said, is this the end? Is this how our lives end?
Waar ons leven eindigt, ja.
Und das war einfach ein Chaos. Ja, es gab keine.
It was simply chaos. There was no command, no instruction. The uniformed officers were not there, but rather it was the people from the kitchen, the restaurant, the maids, or the men who worked in room service. They helped the passengers a little bit, but they weren't really trained.
Die Zimmermädchen oder es waren auch Männer, die da im Room Service arbeiten, die haben sich die Passagiere ein bisschen gekümmert. Aber die waren natürlich dafür gar nicht vorbereitet.
And I remember saying to trying to reassure a French passenger, she said, oh, I'm very scared, what am I going to do, what am I going to do? And I said, don't worry, the only time you have to worry is when you hear the general emergency signal. And as I said that, the general emergency signal was sounded. And I said, right, now you need to put your life jacket on.
At 10:33 p.m., nearly an hour after hitting the rocks, Captain Schettino ordered the general emergency. 10 minutes later, his first officer urged him to order abandon ship, but again he waited. The dream vacation aboard the Costa Concordia had turned into a nightmare for the 4,000 people aboard. When singer Ian Fraser reached his muster station shortly before 11 p.m., the situation was degenerating.
We were leaning so far, once you get past 20 degrees, launching a life raft on the side that's away from the water becomes almost impossible. And I remember a life raft being launched, deployed, and it stuck on the side of the ship, but they kept lowering it, and it just tilted to the vertical. Full of people, you could hear people screaming, you could hear people falling inside it. All the crew members on the ship watching this were screaming, saying, stop, stop, stop lowering the boat, stop lowering the boat. But they lowered it far too far, and then finally, with it stuck on the side and tilting to the vertical, they finally stopped, and it broke away from the side of the ship and swang and clanged back into the ship. And I remember thinking, this is terrible.
Then they did start winching us down. But the problem was that halfway down we got stuck. The lifeboat got stuck because it didn't have free clearance, but got stuck on the side of the vessel because of the list. And then, for the first time, that's when I became really afraid.
But Giglio residents had no idea of the drama about to engulf them.
I opened my window and saw this lit-up building right in front of me. I called my husband and said, "Come look at this spectacle. Look at this huge, beautiful ship in front of us."
Mario Pellegrini is the island's deputy mayor. He would save many lives that night.
Mi sono precipitato qua in porto, la mia casa dista dalla strada.
I hurried here to the port, which is 10 minutes away from where I live on the other side of the island, and I was amazed to see this huge ship which was tilting 10 to 20 degrees there on the rocks.
Era fuori gli scogli.
Meanwhile, passengers like the young French couple, Mylène and Michael, were unable to board lifeboats on the ship's port side. They were forced to cross the ship, but the other side was overcrowded and would soon slip down into the sea.
Maar wat we gezien hebben, men moet zich dat voorstellen.
What we saw, one must try to imagine. It was unreal. I had to hold on to my husband's coat. Then a member of the crew came over and said, "Fast, fast, run to level 3, quickly, quickly." But it was difficult to go fast, fast, because the ship was tilting so much.
Omdat het schip zo...
And someone shouted, "Come on guys, you need to get off now." So the ship is now listing at 45 degrees. The wall and the floor are at this angle, so you're walking at the bottom of a V.
6 of 7 mensen van crew.
There were 6 or 7 members of the crew that had made a human chain so that we could get up the corridor, and you grabbed a hold of each of their shirts to pull yourself up. We arrived at level 3 and there was a door. My husband went through it, but a woman in front of me fell down and was injured. There was a crew member who had come to help the woman, and he said in English, "She's going down." And I didn't know if he meant the woman or if he was referring to the ship. She is going down.
En ik wist toen niet of hij bedoelde of deze vrouw iedere keer terug zou vallen of dat het schip aan het zinken was. She is going down.
I do not know how I got from deck 3 into the lifeboat. I don't know. What I do know is that while I was on the deck, I saw 4 hands reach out over me and pull me into the boat.
Naar boven komen en die hebben mij werkelijk van het dak in de boot geholpen.
Wir waren eine kleine Gruppe, die überlegt hat, zu springen. War natürlich Chaos.
There was a small group of us that considered jumping. It was chaos. People were packed. There were so many small children and elderly. We thought, let's wait and let them in the boats first and see how the situation develops. It was at that point that we decided that if the ship goes over to the side, we can quickly jump off and swim away from it. But fortunately, a boat came, and I said, "So, this is our last chance to get off the boat, dry and safely." And that's what we did.
Und sicher von Bord gehen können, das haben wir dann auch gemacht.
So we got to the starboard side, the water's lapping, a lifeboat is trying to get to us, but the ship is leaning so far it can't get any closer to us, and it sails away. Quite rightly, it would have been dangerous for it to come any closer. So I'm not putting any blame on that.
As lifeboats began arriving in port, island officials braced for the massive influx of people.
Abbiamo aperto gli asili perché sono dei contenitori di grandi.
We open the nurseries because they contain large halls, and so large rooms that can house a lot of people. We open the churches, we open the schools, because they're heated, and so they could in some way host all these people.
Mario Pellegrini volunteered to go onto the ship to liaise with the captain. A lifeboat took him out to the Concordia's rope ladder so he could climb on board.
E lì mi sono forse subito accorto che quello che potevo fare, quello che era andato per fare, non lo potevo più.
Then I realized that what I had gone aboard to do had become impossible. There was chaos. People were crying. There were people laughing who didn't realize how bad the situation was.
At 12:18 a.m., the ship began turning over. Thousands of tons of water swilled inside the ship as the submerged glass windows broke under pressure. More water rushed in, and as it moved through the ship, pulled people down. According to court documents, this was the most fatal moment of the disaster.
And there's about 30 passengers, 40 passengers, and about a dozen crew by now at the back of deck 4. And what do? You're slipping, you're sliding, you're trying to hold on to something. You can't stay upright. I'm hanging on to a door. As it ended up, the Concordia rested on the rocks and stayed there. But we didn't know. It could have been that the ship was going to suddenly just slide down in seconds, gone. There was a passenger standing at an open gateway, the water lapping at his feet, and he said, "What do I do?" And I remember people said, "Go, go, jump now, go." Myself and Kirsty, Stephen, Joe, and passengers, with our life jackets on, we just jumped.
During this confusion, Schettino got into a lifeboat and left the Costa Concordia. Mario Pellegrini had found the bridge, but no officers. He was headed down a corridor to help others when the ship began to turn over.
In quel corridoio eravamo.
There were about 100 people in that corridor. People were yelling, there were screams, crying. It was like what you might expect from a film. That's how it was in that moment.
Film così era in quel momento.
And the sound stays with you. There are people screaming, and that crunching metallic sound. I know it's a cliche to talk about the Titanic, but it's exactly the sound that you hear in that film is the sound that we heard. Things crashing inside the ship, metal groaning, twisting, and the ship, such a cliche, dying.
Mario and the others were stuck in the heavily tilting corridor when they found a ladder one of the officers had put down.
100 people were massed at the bottom of that step ladder. The scene was quite violent. There was no more chivalry. The idea that elderly and children should go first had disappeared.
Il far passare i vecchi e i bambini era una cosa, un'utopia.
All night, Pellegrini worked together with the ship's doctor and the purser, extracting passengers with ropes and ladders from dark, watery corridors.
Quando cercavamo di farli uscire piano piano tutto insieme abbiamo sentito delle grida.
As we were trying to get them out slowly but surely, we heard shouts. These shouts came from shafts. I call them shafts because they were the central corridors of the ship that went from right to left of the ship. And when the ship capsized, these became vertical shafts, and I heard shouts coming from one of them. I called a purser who said that he had nothing, and then we found a small rope. We opened the trap door and saw the people at the bottom of the corridor calling for help. The water was rising, and many were already in a state of panic. They had looked death in the face.
Prese dal panico, l'ultimo aveva proprio gli occhi con la morte in faccia.
Swimming away, looking back and looking at that with the funnel towering on you. And I remember thinking, I'm going to swim to safety, but the funnel's going to break off. It was at such an angle, the funnel is just going to shear off and crash into the sea.
As the lives of many were being saved by the tenacity of the few, Giglio residents and Italian Coast Guard began coordinating a massive rescue and recovery operation.
È questa? Dov'è? Eccola qui. È affondata!
At midnight on January the 13th, Italian Coast Guard infrared cameras recorded the Costa Concordia cruise ship partially capsized just off the coast of the island of Giglio. Water was rushing into the ship. Passengers were trapped both inside and on the ship's slippery exterior. Some had swum to shore.
Made it to rocks, and two elderly passengers with life jackets were swimming in the water. And I said, "You're all right," and I pulled them out of the water, and we climbed up a fairly rocky slope. There was no vegetation. And we climbed up and stood on top of a rocky cliff top with by now, about 60, 70 people.
On the outer hull of the ship, I met the officer Canessa, who had laid all those rope ladders to get people down. It was hard to walk on the outer hull, especially because some people needed help, such as the elderly and children. I saw that the people had begun disembarking, and they were coming towards the church with towels and stuff, and they were there on the steps. So we opened the church because we thought if these people had already come off the ship, Who knows how many others there were, and we had to find a place for them.
Residents opened up their private homes and helped passengers in their desperate search for loved ones.
Però io pensavo solamente all'inizio, nessuno aveva capito la portata dell'evento, credo.
To begin with, I thought, well, no one understood how big the event really was. I had 2 guest rooms, so I thought I would put 2 people in the guest rooms. In the end, we had about 50 people here.
Avevo una cinquantina di persone alla fine, abbiamo portato a casa.
In Livorno, Coast Guard Commander Gregorio De Falco finally reached Captain Schettino.
Senta, io sono De Falco da Livorno, parlo col comandante? Col comandante Schettino, comandante. Schettino? Sì. Ascolti Schettino, ci sono persone intrappolate a bordo, adesso lei va con la sua chaloupe sotto la prua della nave, lato dritto, c'è una biscaggina. Lei sale su quella biscaggina e va a bordo della nave. In questo momento la nave è inclinata. Ho capito. Che sta facendo, comandante? Sto qua per coordinare i soccorsi. Che sta coordinando lì? Vada a bordo, mi coordini i soccorsi da bordo. Lei si rifiuta? No, non mi sto rifiutando. Lei si sta rifiutando di andare a bordo, comandante? No, ci sto andando. E mi dica qual è il motivo per cui non ci va. Ci sto andando perché ci sta l'altra lancia che si è fermata. Lei vada a bordo, è un ordine. Lei non deve fare altre valutazioni. Lei ha dichiarato l'abbandono nave. Adesso comando io. Lei vada a bordo. Okay. Ci sono già dei cadaveri, Schettino. Avanti. Quanti cadaveri ci sono? Non lo so. Uno l'ho sentito. Me lo devi dire lei quanti ce ne sono, Cristo. Però, ma ti rende conto che è buio e che qua non vediamo nulla? E che vuole tornare a casa, Schettino? È buio, vuole tornare a casa? Adesso va a bordo. Subito a dire quante persone ci sono. Va bene, comandante. Vada, subito.
But Captain Schettino never returned to his ship. Back on Giglio, coping with 4,000 shipwrecked survivors was a Herculean task.
I was hugely impressed by the inhabitants of the island. It is a small island. There are not that many people. And in the port, even fewer. They were magnificent. They threw blankets and towels from their windows because some passengers were drenched as they had jumped into the water.
Mijn eerste gedachte als ik aan land kwam.
My first thought when I got on land was, well, I looked over at the ship and then I thought, how can one find someone in this mass of people? But he was standing about 20 to 30 meters away from me, and I was glad to see him. Afterwards, he also said he was glad to see me.
Ja.
Voor mij, ik stond op de kaai en had al een paar keren rond.
I was standing on the quay and had already looked a few times around to see if I could catch a glimpse of a well-known face. And then there was the moment that I saw her, 20 or 30 meters away from me. My wife, with a mobile phone in her hand, trying to call me.
Poi invece verso l'una ho trovato una signora tedesca.
Around 1, I found a German woman in a complete state of shock. Wet, without socks, without shoes, and her feet were bluish. From 1 o'clock on, we started searching for her husband, who had remained on the ship to help her handicapped friend. It was an endless search, with this mantra, roter, 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 who was her husband. We were looking for tall men with gray hair. In the end, at 6, we found him in the church. It was terrible. Terrible. Terrible thing.
Come erano vestiti sono scesi. Quindi c'è chi era.
They were dressed exactly the same way they were when they got off the ship. The people who were having dinner were dressed up in evening clothes. And when they arrived in church, there's one bathroom, and there was a lot of women all dressed up in evening dress and lame and high heels.
Vedevi tutte queste donne con questi bei vestiti da sera, no? Col lamè, col tacco.
As dawn rose, ferries began taking passengers to the mainland, where the civil defense had begun setting up tents for first aid and shelter.
And
then when the people realized they were on an island, there were scenes of panic because no one wanted to get back on board.
And we spent the night in a church, and people were sleeping in the church, in the local school, in all sorts of buildings they could find. And then the following morning, a ferry left at 8 o'clock, and kind of the last thing you wanted to do was be back on the sea again, but you realized you didn't have much choice.
So we all got together and went down to the ferry that was going to leave at 11. And we were all there hugging and kissing. As you can imagine, they kept blowing us kisses until they disappeared over the horizon. We felt so relieved that this huge mass of people had finally left, and this emergency was finally over. But no, the world came to Giglio.
Il mondo al Giglio è venuto.
The media, investigators, rescue workers and salvage teams all descended on Giglio, where shaken family members also waited desperately for news of their missing loved ones.
We'd been waiting for news for 2 days, and we were starting to be very anxious to know what was happening. And on Monday morning, I saw the first reports on TV about the divers going into the Costa Concordia, and I began to say, we have to do something. We have to go there, because we have to find our children.
És amikor mentünk át, a konzulnő kísért bennünket, a Giglio szigetre megyünk, már föl is szállt.
We were escorted to Giglio Island by the lady consul. We boarded the ferry and were actually heading to the island when she received a phone call about 5 newly found bodies, one of them presumed to be Shani. The ferry turned around and we got off, and we had to go to a hospital in Grosseto to identify him. That was it. No one had been sure whether it was him or not. We had been hoping it was someone else, and that's when I saw him. I had to identify him. That's when I had to face the fact that he was dead.
Nekem kellett azonosítani, és ott szembesültem vele, igen, hogy ő volt.
In the weeks that followed, rescuers dramatically saved 3 more lives and recovered the bodies of more victims. The families of the 32 dead pleaded for justice. Francesco Schettino was arrested and a criminal investigation was launched to find out why the Concordia sank and who was responsible. Removing the precarious vessel from the rocks of Giglio, however, would take more than a year, cost millions, and prove to be one of the most risky and complex salvage operations in nautical history.